those ways. Although it would be anachronistic to say that Feuerbach is following Modest Mouse, of course. It's true that for Feuerbach, he thought that religion got in the way. Religion and or God, you can combine those or separate them, it doesn't matter. Religion for Feuerbach is very similar to how Modest Mouse frames the part of this song that's kind of a conversation to God. They say, you fit like a shirt made out of wasps. That's how they feel about religion. It's a shirt. It's a thing that it makes sense that it exists in our kind of world, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. In fact, for Feuerbach, as for Modest Mouse, religion is the exact opposite of what it purports to be. And by that, I mean just quite simply, religion is not good, as religions tend to suggest of themselves. But in fact, it's bad. Why is it bad? It's bad because it cuts into our capacity to know who it is that we really are. And to the extent that we don't know who it is that we really are, then we shortchange our time here on earth. We are, for Feuerbach or for Modest Mouse, we're carbon. That's on the one hand, that's the thing that cuts us down to size, right? It's the thing that tells us and reminds us to be humble. But on the other hand, if we are somehow detached from that recognition, it prevents us from being the thing that it is that we are. So we stop being available or accessible to ourselves or to others. So that's a brief introduction to Feuerbach by way of Modest Mouse. But there's a lot more to talk about than just that. So the story of Feuerbach begins with another person, someone, a different figure who studied religion, named Friedrich Schleiermacher. In 1799, Schleiermacher published what a lot of folks will say is the first text in the study of religion, or in religious studies in general. The name of the book is On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. You don't need to know that, but I want you to have a sense of what Schleiermacher is doing here. So, across the last 300 years in much of Europe, religion had seen first a kind of period of reinvigoration and awakening in the form of the Protestant Reformation. But then the Reformation is kind of along the same decades of time, but also quickly after it. Lots and lots of Reformation, lots of reforms ended up leading to really bad shit, like villages fighting with other villages quite often. There are lots of different periods, depending on where you're looking in Europe, where this is the case. And a combination of all of that bad stuff that was the outgrowth of the Reformation, alongside a growing intellectual tradition that we have come to call the Enlightenment, created a situation where by the 1700s, in much of Europe, religion was thought poorly of. So was belief in God. It's a much more, during this period across Germany and parts of France, it's a much more secular moment than, say, the United States has ever experienced. But that comparison is kind of just for your own edification. The more important thing is that religion, thanks to some of these philosophical ideas and thinkers, comes to be held with suspicion. Don't worry so much about how we get to this point, but at this time, religion is largely considered a vestige of the past. Well, Schleiermacher comes in And he wants to say no, religion matters. And so for him, he names this book Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers because he considers the folks who are, you could call them atheists or people who don't like religion for one reason or another, they're turning to particularly German culture around these decades in order to harvest from life something of value. Like what is it about life that has value, and where can we find it? For these folks, they were turning to culture for Schleiermacher's perspective, at the expense of religion. So he has this feeling, and I use that word to emphasize a pun. So he says that all of us as humans have a feeling associated with that experience of being a human. This is what Schleiermacher says. And you could think of it similar as well to the kind of feeling that Modest Mouse conveys in the song that I played. So while they have a problem with religion, they're trying to articulate some feeling of connectedness. That's really all that I can offer right now in the way of what this feeling is. But there's just something. And here I want you all to like turn to moments in your own lives when you might have had some semblance of this feeling. If what Schleiermacher is talking about resonates with you, then you're part of this perspective. You're exemplifying the thing that Schleiermacher is talking about. And what he's talking about is when we reflect on the big picture items of life, who we love, who we hate, how long we're here, our mortality, things like that, we come into an awareness of what he calls absolute dependence. And all of this is predicated on feeling. For the cultured despisers, for the folks who did not like religion, they had essentially relegated it to an intellectual process. That is, so by way of thinkers like René Descartes, folks have come to consider the idea of God as a purely philosophical issue. There are folks who believe in God, and there are folks who don't. The folks who do believe in God, we end up calling them rationalists. We don't today, but then that's what we were calling them. And at the same time, another group of folks are starting to think that the point of religion is really about morality. This is another still very popular general belief about religion. Not a religious belief, but you get the difference. So what is religion? Religion is all that stuff that teaches us how to behave, how to think about how we should act, and the actual how to act. So Schleiermacher is wanting to come in and say both of those camps are wrong. Religion at best, or at its most fundamental rather, is about a feeling, a kind of recognition of one's place in the world or the universe over and against the immenseness of that universe. The first part of this feeling for him, and this is an important kind of technical piece of the puzzle, is a sense of our immediate self-consciousness. So this piece here would probably be easier if we were in person, so I could kind of get into your faces a little bit more than I would be able to here. But I want each of you to pause for a moment and think about whether or not you have a sense of self that you can't help but say is different from everybody else. It may sound like I'm being oversimplistic because we don't tend to reflect critically on things like experience, but that's what I want you to do. So what is the substance of our, what we come to popularly call our self-consciousness? If we had the time, we could have a debate about what that substance is. And the truth be told, we still don't know. This, for a lot of folks who, coming from a religious angle, a confessional posture, will think about this issue in terms of a soul, for instance. Is the thing that makes you you, is it here? That's the question. Where is that spark? You can think of it that way. That distinguishes you from the sum total of the cells connected that work together to create the physical representation of you. Is there a distinction there? Schleiermacher is saying, hell yes, absolutely. There is a big distinction. And the way that he knows that is, for him, through feeling. And he even defines it. So now I'll go to my script. So he says religion is a feeling of absolute dependence. So one comes into an awareness of oneself and the isolation, not loneliness, not that kind of feeling, not an emotional kind of thing, but a feeling of a kind of forced connectedness to others, that even in that same moment reinforces a notion of your radical separation from everyone else. So for him, this is what religion addresses. Today we would call these existential concerns, but at the time that it would be anachronistic to call them that for that time. But religion for him is the feeling of immediate consciousness of the universal existence of all finite things. That is everything. For Schleiermacher, everything has that finite quality, that quality of being separate from everything else. Additionally, he, as a part of this, he considered that all things are also temporal. Everything is temporal. In other words, things come to an end. Everything has a beginning and a middle and an end. For him, the stuff of God, or kind of universal energy, however we would think about it today, for him, this sense of feeling, this sense of being absolutely dependent, he says, is kind of the entry point into understanding what religion is. It does more than prove it. It gives an indication of what it's about. So, yes, to the cultured despisers, Schleiermacher was wanting to say that religion was a good thing and religion was a thing. It wasn't bullshit. It was something that could be trusted. How do we trust it? Well, we trust it because we all share this feeling of absolute dependence. And by that, he means to emphasize that all of these finite things, when seen as a whole, a W-H-O-L-E, they come to create something of the infinite. So in other words, incomplete things create a complete picture. That's a piece of it. The other piece of it for him is that temporal things, things with a beginning, a middle, and an end, all of the things are that kind of thing, and therefore, in those things, we have a sense of what he calls eternal. And the basic, it's the same pattern, it's the same logic. The only difference here is he's speaking in terms of space and time. He's covering his ground in that way. The religion, then, ultimately, this concludes the Schleiermachian prelude. Religion is the stuff that we do in our recognition of those things. For him, most of his work is not this theoretical end of it. For him, this is Christianity. So he doesn't, when pressed in that regard, he wouldn't really worry over it. He wasn't very concerned with thinking about alternative cultural expressions of this thing. So that, though, then gives way to what we call modern theology today. And Germany found itself in the position of having essentially two schools of thought on religion. Everyone was interested in religion, although not everyone liked it, essentially. There were two camps that emerged. There were the believers and there were the atheists. There are other ways we could frame that divide. But that's kind of the backstory that you need to know to make sense of the situation, the cultural milieu in which Feuerbach enters the picture. So Ludwig Feuerbach, he gives us the first projection theory of religion. Projection. From about 1800 up until Feuerbach, essentially, philosophers and theologians of the period are responding to the question of if God exists, then where is God? What is God doing? And the most popular answer, philosophically, came by way of a different philosopher named Hegel. And Hegel essentially created a theory that sought to find God in the substance of history. Again, I'm oversimplifying it on the fly. Hegel essentially is saying that history is constantly changing. This is one thing that we know of history. And so he says that there must be some sort of spirit at work in history. Geist is the German word that he uses. And that word conveys a kind of religious quality, but it also conveys a kind of ghostly quality as well. So this Geist is at work in human history. And to make a long story short, Hegel comes to realize that God is real and does exist and exists in the form of material culture expressing itself in history. The effect of this is to essentially rationalize the current then circumstances where Hegel found himself or where any of these folks found themselves. The effect of this qualitatively was that different communities in Northern Europe looked around and saw themselves and saw radically disparate social realities. Saw different sorts of people seemingly doing different sorts of things. And this theory of Hegel's helped to rationalize that why and how they became on top. There's no way to disconnect these issues. And quite literally, as far as the philosophy and the way that ideology works, this is kind of the foundation of what becomes the one of the uglier expressions of what we call white supremacy across the 19th century. Because this framework, it had the effect of proving that God existed, and simultaneously how it proves that God exists is by saying, well, history unfolds as it should always. And since we are on the top of the social ladder, then it stands to reason that God is behind us. God is on our side, so to speak. Feuerbach is regarded as what we call a young Hegelian or a left Hegelian. He was deeply influenced by Hegel, only, here's the important distinction, he says that the idea that we're on top because God wills it, and Because God wills it, that means that what I do is at any given moment, to the extent that it is history, then it justifies itself. He says that whole framework is ridiculous, says it's not accurate. He says that Hegel came to highly problematic conclusions. Now, mind you, he's doing this for intellectual reasons. This is not like he's being some sort of paragon of social justice. That's not motivating him. In fact, Feuerbach is widely remembered as a virulent anti-Semite. I'm sure he had his anti-black racism as well, although he didn't write about that in the same way that he in another book absolutely rails against Jews for essentially creating all of the problems that he wants to say religion has started. So this brings up a complicated point, one that in contemporary our culture folks are wrestling with all the time. To what degree do we owe someone our ear? How do we make sense of both angles? How can we learn from him, but also take responsibility for his work, for his ideas in a way that he never would have? That's kind of a big kind of meta-ethical concern for us. Nevertheless, he sets in motion what ends up what we call a critical perspective on religion. He ends up someone who's able to see how it works without having to buy into how it works. Now, his ideas surrounding where these problems emerge, utterly fallacious. None of that is true. Hence, none of it is included here one way or the other. But to the extent that he offers this first projection theory, it's a helpful theory. For him, he says that Schleiermacher is similar to Hegel, both right and wrong. Schleiermacher is right to the extent that how we can come to understand or study religion requires us to turn to that same feeling of absolute dependence. The same feeling. Feuerbach is not going to call it absolute dependence, because dependence indicates some sort of object, right? Like that would indicate that there's a God on the other end of it. But whether or not there's a God on the other end of it, Feuerbach is recognizing that at the very least, this feeling for lots and lots of people is a real feeling. You could call it an existential yearning, or I don't know. You could think about this in kind of stereotyped ways. Like if you're an art lover, the first time you saw whatever your favorite art piece is. If you are a nature lover, then maybe the first time you ever see Yosemite Valley. Or if you're, I don't know, interested in life, maybe it's the first time you see a childbirth. Like moments of intense aesthetic appreciation cut us to an awareness of us being part of something bigger than ourselves. That's where Feuerbach and Schleiermacher agree. But for Feuerbach, he says Schleiermacher is taking for granted the idea that this somehow proves the existence of God. The only thing that this feeling proves is that we are connected by way of this feeling. Incidentally, just as a quick qualifier, it is today widely debated and contested as to whether or not all of us even share this experience. So I don't want to do it myself, but I don't even want any of you to assume what it is that Feuerbach is assuming. Here, this would be a really good example of how to critique Feuerbach. Feuerbach assumes that we all share a basic psychological profile. Increasingly, we know that that's not the case. So it's an open question whether or not all humans have a sense of what it is that Feuerbach and Schleiermacher are driving at. But in the face of this feeling, Feuerbach comes to offer this perspective, which is, you could also call it a humanist perspective. So Feuerbach is not saying that all of this doesn't matter. What he's saying is that it is that religion has paradoxically been an outgrowth of this situation, but at the same time it has prevented our awareness. Theology is anthropology. He said, I can follow Schleiermacher to the extent that he's telling me where this thing comes from. This thing being this feeling. But when it comes to him saying that it comes from God or it comes from somewhere else, Feuerbach is like, look, you got to show me the evidence. And nobody can show Feuerbach the evidence. When he thinks about where all of this comes from, he sees it that this comes from maybe an unlikely place, but at the same time, an obvious place. Where does it come from? Where does religion come from? Where does God come from? It comes from us. Theology is in reality anthropology. That is, to talk of God is to intrinsically and innately talk of oneself. This is where the idea of it being a projection theory is so important. Feuerbach, for his part, cannot imagine. Now, granted, he's thinking about a particular tradition, or at best, two traditions, that being Christianity and Judaism. But for Feuerbach, he can't help but to recognize that every instance he's ever heard or seen or read in reference to God can actually be reduced or deconstructed back down to a kind of bare bones concern over humans. And I would challenge any of you right now too to think of an exception to this rule. Whether you have some of your own, maybe your God is really, really good at Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Mine wouldn't be, but maybe that's a quirk of how you think about it. So that would be an example, but so too would more ordinary things. One of the things that he focuses his time on is the idea of love. Is a very popular idea today, more so than at the time then. So love has, for a very long time, been an attribute or a quality attributed to God in a lot of traditions. But these days, amongst believers in the modern West, this is a very, very popular idea. It's kind of a bargain, not like a good deal in the sense of something expensive in exchange for something cheap, but it's a bargain in the sense of a moral exchange. That is, rather than get rid of God, we're just going to attribute to God the stuff that we know we can agree on. If you want to make a big ass boat, like a 300-foot yacht or something like that, no one person can do that. It could be one person that imagines that yacht, but there'd be no conceivable way that such a yacht could be made by one person. Now, mapping that same kind of formula or logic onto religion, Schleiermacher understands that we're all connected. Yachts get built, so to speak, because there's an underlying connectivity that essentially is God, or at the very least is the stuff that connects us to God, and we all share that also. Whereas for Feuerbach, he doesn't see any of that. What he sees is merely the feeling. He knows that people can do amazing things simply by virtue of an idea, and he also knows that many of those ideas require collaboration and cooperation at rates that are substantial, but there's no evidence that there's anything more happening. So whereas Schleiermacher holds that the sheer variety of things that can be accomplished as well as things that maybe cannot be accomplished is indicative of the existence of God, Feuerbacher says no. And he takes it one step further. Suppose that the thing that we're talking about creating is not a yacht anymore. Suppose the thing we're talking about creating is the thing Schleiermacher seemingly is obsessed with, God. What if God is nothing but the space, an empty vessel, or merely an idea that represents the space where all of our biggest ideas go? This is literally what the word projection is meant to convey. So I'm going to have an idea over here. Maybe it's the idea of strength. Relatedly, the thinking about how to build bicep muscle, for instance. You're going to like max out in any given moment. Then you're going to imagine that you can overcome whatever plateau you have to this point already or like hit, and then you're going to set about working at some sort of interval capacity, and in doing so you're going to overcome that previous limitation. So like overcoming obstacles is within our reach as humans. Feuerbach would be the first to agree with this. But he wants to take it a step further and say that God is the thing we've created to represent all of the highest possibilities. He distinguishes between this. He distinguishes between subjects and attributes, and he does it in a philosophical way that kind of matters, but not, the technicalities of it don't matter so much. But what he says is that Schleiermacher is confusing attributes for the subject of the attributes, whereas he wants to reorient that. He wants to say that our talk of the subject or the object, depending on your outlook, is indicative of the attributes that we hold as people. That's where the evidence is for Feuerbach. And on this point, he's more complicated than simply offering an atheist critique of religion. He detests Christianity and Judaism for kind of different reasons, but in the context of Christianity, the reason he detests it is because for him it makes us hypocrites. It forces us to deny or ignore our fundamental connectedness insofar as we project the substance or the attributes of that connectedness onto a cosmic screen. So for him, he's a humanist in this way. People matter for him, and he thinks that religion is making it harder for people to matter to other people. Each of us, all as humans, are connected through our consciousness and our existence. And here, for those of you who are digging this content, this is a really important point that you'll want to remember, although you don't have to. Is that here he's distinguishing between our shared experience of having impossible to duplicate experiences. One of the things that unites us all is that we have an experience of our own consciousness. What we do with that, how we think about it, that's all debatable and contextually specific. But we can all trust that when I reference some perceptual distinction between the stuff that is physically making me and my feeling of being something, some great big possibility, everyone who's ever existed on this planet will know the kind of thing I'm talking about. We'll disagree on why or whether or not that kind of thing matters. But everyone has had some sort of experience, and by experience I mean it in a technical sense. An experience is something that brings you into an awareness of the slippage between your sense of self and the substance of your physical person. So when we get into the nitty-gritty of it, well, for folks who study this, what we know is that each of us has those experiences, but we also know that there's no way to completely share the meanings associated with those experiences. This is as true of powerful experiences as it is of mundane experiences. Religious experiences are an easy way to think about and theorize what we're talking about, but this is true of language, it's true of how we communicate, it's true of what's happening quite literally right now. There's something happening over here that I'm trying to convey to each of you, and for me to convey that information, I'm having to tap into past experiences in such a way that I'm hoping, it's like I'm throwing a silly putty against a wall hoping it sticks. And I just have to do it enough that it finds a way to stick to each of you a little bit. How it sticks is by you doing some version of that similar process. Only you guys are mostly on the receiving end of this right now, but the same will hold true of this process when you start talking to a friend. Maybe you call a friend and you have something to say or a lot to talk about. So the same thing's happening, but with two other people. There's only so much that we are able to convey in any one of those experiences. But those things are the stuff that, so kind of like the most fundamental particle of social life. Experiences build on experiences, build on experiences, creating everything from language to music and painting to technology to religion and everything else in between. For Feuerbach, we are all connected because that's who it is that we are. We are these things that somehow stumble through the world, having knowledge of our capacity to share experiences with other people, but always, as a component of any of those experiences, a knowledge that we're never going to be able to share everything. This is what matters for Feuerbach, and why he's pissed off at religious folks. Religious folks, for Feuerbach, are lying because they're acting like we can share more than what we can share. And he says this gets us in the way, this stands in the way of our capacity to do the thing really incumbent upon all of us to do, insofar as that's who it is that we are. In other words, to share experiences. And he takes this specifically in terms of the Christian preoccupation with God. For instance, the 2 commandments as they are distilled in the New Testament scripture are love God, worship God, and love your neighbor as thyself, essentially. Feuerbach is of the opinion that our preoccupation with doing the first thing gets in the way of our capacity to do the second thing. So we share, all of us, the sense of consciousness, what we could technically call intersubjective experience, where you come to a table, I come to a table, we exchange essentially energy, if we're thinking about it either in terms of physical properties or if we're thinking of it in kind of hokey new age spiritual properties. It's the same stuff, and it's energy. That's what it is in a nutshell. Like, intersubjective experience is when you bring some of your energy, I bring some of my energy, and we let it mingle for however long. And then we go about our business, and we do that in other moments. Ad infinitum. For Feuerbach, that's who it is that we are. But there's a two-ness that I want to emphasize. The two-ness is, or the second component is the thing that religion ignores or downplays. Particularly as the idea of God develops as a means. Again, remember the philosophy piece of it. Remember, Hegel is using God in order to justify historical circumstance. Feuerbach has a big problem with this. Because for him, religion is the thing that does that cuts into our capacity to share those experiences. The second piece of it is the existential piece. We're in this existential predicament where not only does the world, the social world, unfold in a way that is disparately felt by people. Like, why is it that some of us have to deal with sexism while others of us get to remain like acting like it doesn't exist? The same holds true for racism. How is it that some of us literally have to move through the world experiencing a heightened statistical possibility of early death by way of, in this case, the one we're talking about in culture, by law enforcement, the folks who are meant to protect us, over and against others of us are somehow existing and are built from so many of these experiences that we have the capacity or the audacity to deny that the other folks' problem is even a problem. Like, that's not everyone who doesn't believe that Black Lives Matter, I mean this in the political sense, not everyone who believes that is having a critical kind of consciousness or an awareness about the consequences of their perspective. A lot of folks think that they're morally justified, is the point that I'm making. How do those circumstances come about? To say nothing of the concrete politics and how to change them. We'll talk about that with Marx. That's the big debate between Feuerbach and Marx, in fact. But for Feuerbach, he's saying religion causes us to ignore all of this stuff. And you see this play out actually even in terms of the examples that I just offered. There are lots and lots of religious folks who will respond to the problem, the human problem of having problems, whether it's racism or child abuse or anything in between, by thinking of it in terms of God working in mysterious ways, but God somehow still being in charge. That has a tacit effect of, for a lot of people, justifying or exonerating those problems, saying that's just the way the world works. Feuerbach is in some ways representative of a position like that, but say in terms of race or ethnicity, but in terms of religion, he recognizes one of the things that all of us would agree with now as scholars of religion, that religion has an effect often of having folks feel better about situations that they may be culpable in. You might still like religion after I've said that, or you might not. It doesn't really make one way it doesn't make any difference one way or another to what we're talking about now. Feuerbach just wants us to start being honest about that. So he said religion gets in the way of our capacity to recognize our own limitations. It tricks us into acting like God through our belief in God. Because God gets to be the thing where we hold all the highest expressions of any of those possibilities. Feels great sometimes, unless you're on the receiving end of someone else's religion. But he said, no, the world is way more complicated than that. At the end of the day, we're carbon. He didn't know that at the time, but it's the same perspective as Modest Mouse. We are amazing, beautiful, complicated creatures to the extent that we recognize that there are certain limits, certain boundaries that are not necessarily obstacles to overcome, but they're constitutive aspects of who it is that we are. And at the most fundamental level, before the social movements, before familial violence, before anything that we might deem socially problematic, is the fundamental experience that we call human. And what that is a two-ness. It's the thing that is me now, able to, at some level, vibe with each of you, like at the level of a frequency, to transmit something. But it's also the thing that will always fail at that exact task. There's never an experience where you can't post facto say, I could have or should have done this or that. Religion tricks us, Feuerbach is telling us, into thinking that we can stop reflecting on that aspect of what it means to be human. There's a quote that I will, I guess, mostly end with. He thinks, here's an important point for Wednesday, and I guess next week as well. Feuerbach, as you've just heard me talk about, And as you've read, I hope, Feuerbach does not like, in a kind of moral sense, he doesn't like religion. It does the thing that I just described. It gets in the way of us being fully ourselves. But in an intellectual sense, he doesn't think we should get rid of it. That's not his issue. His issue is, again, now what we would call existential. He's interested in how each of us as individuals is impacted by this. So he says religion, rather than do away with it, it provides a wonderful opportunity for us to learn about ourselves. The ethnographic utility of theology, you might call it. In this projection, we're able to learn a great deal about who it is that we are. But he says, this is the quote I want to end with. He says, man, and here he means everyone, but he could just as easily only mean men. Moreover, he could just as easily only mean white men. This is an example, one of countless illustrations of that second side that he wants to bring into parity with the other side, the possibility with the peril. He can at the same time be saying something that might resonate with all humans moving down the road of time that is coming at the expense of whole groups of other humans. This is not to celebrate the man. This is to humanize the man. So he says here, man, this is the mystery of religion, projects his being into objectivity, and then again makes himself an object to this projected image of himself, thus converted a subject. He thinks of himself as an object to himself. This is what's happening when we think about God or when we pray. This is what Feuerbach's position on it, at least. But as the object of an object, as another being than himself. So in our belief in God, or any of you who believe in God, in that believing, you're projecting the part of you that needs to be put into that portrait in such a fashion that you can have a kind of conversation with yourself in the form of prayer, or if you're thinking more theologically, maybe it's some sort of intellectual or epistemological rationale for this. But he says, thus here, man is an object to God. By making the divine activity a means of human salvation, man has in fact no other aim than himself. The divine activity is not distinct from the human. Who is it that we are at the most fundamental level for Feuerbach? We are the thing that will always have these experiences, that will always leave us wanting more and better experiences. This is for Feuerbach what we might call the human predicament. It is the fundamental challenge. We are the thing that knows itself inadequate to experience the thing that we are. That's a bit of a mindfuck, right? Think about that. We're all smart enough to know that we're not smart enough to do all of the things that we're also aware of that we need to do if we want to accomplish certain goals, or if we want to be content unto ourselves or our communities. God, here's the innovative piece. Rather than offer a way out, God here, he says, is helping to create the inability to respond adequately to that situation. By assuming that God is going to take care of all of this, maybe in the by and by, or however you frame it, that gives folks an easy way out, a way to deny who it is that we are. And in that denial, reinforce more problematic modes of relating, modes of intersubjective communication, that could otherwise be more fulfilling, more gratifying, if only this thing, religion, weren't in our way.